further investigation into the matter.
Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain The Spore. This movie tells the story of 10 strangers intersecting through a terrifying chain of events as a mutating fungus spreads through a small town. Will they survive the terrible plague? Let's find out in The Spore. The Spore began with a news that shocked the world on September 17th, with the discovery of a strange spore originating from Antarctica, where the spore has spread throughout the world through the air. The scene then switches to showing the atmosphere in the wilderness on September 23rd. In the forest, a scientist wearing special protective clothing was traversing the forest to find samples of spores which, according to reports, had already spread in the area. In the search, the scientist continued to hear news about the fungus spores that had infected many people. The initial symptom of an infected person is experiencing a high fever, and slowly but surely, the patient's skin tissue will experience severe damage. The scientist then found a piece of a human hand that was filled with mushrooms. Cautiously, he took a sample of the fungus for further investigation. Not far from there, the scientist found a tent that had been infested with flies. When he looked into the tent to check the situation there, the scientist was surprised by discovering a woman's corpse that was rotting and covered in mold. The scientist then tried to contact his colleagues for the discovery of the body, but then the woman's corpse came back to life and attacked him and sprayed liquid on his face. The scientist immediately rushed away from there, while the woman could only lament her fate of turning into an undead. When he found a pool of water deep enough near the cabin, the scientist tried to clean himself there. However, the fungus had infected his entire body and he passed out. The story continues 2 days after the scientist was infected with a fungus. A man named Lowell was doing his hobby, photographing all the subjects he found quite interesting. Lowell, who happened to be in the woods, heard a woman's screams as well as gunshots. He immediately rushed towards the source of the sound, and was so hasty, he did not pay attention to his steps and caused his foot to hit a sharp branch. Because he could not find the location of the source of the sound, Lowell decided to return to his car. Feeling pain, he then checked his leg, which had hit a pointed branch, and it turned out that the pointed branch had caused a severe tear on his leg. Because it was getting late, he decided to spend the night in the forest and treat his wound for a while. After driving for a while, he finally found an empty cabin in the middle of the woods and decided to spend the night there. Night finally came and Lowell felt the unbearable pain in his wound, which was starting to become infected. While trying to cover up his wound, he heard a strange noise outside the cabin. At first he meant to ignore it, but as time went on, the sound bothered him more and more, and he decided to get out of the cabin and check things out. When walking towards the source of the noise, he found the scientist's body that had been covered with mushrooms until his head was no longer in its normal shape. Like the female corpse found by the scientist before, the scientist's body also suddenly rose and sprayed liquid into Lowell's face. A panicked and frightened Lowell immediately got out of there and returned to the cabin. However, the wound on his leg was getting worse and was now infected with a fungus. He got out of the cabin to retrieve his cell phone he had left in the car so he could call for help. However, the scientist's corpse, which has now mutated into an undead, then attacks him, so that he returns to hiding in the cabin. However, unbeknownst to Lowell, the scientist, who has now completely mutated into an undead, continues to stalk him from outside the cabin and try to break into the inside. Lowell heard the noise again, but now it was coming from the attic of the cabin. When he checked the conditions in the attic, he again got another gush of liquid from the same undead. He hurried down and closed the attic. The next morning, Lowell, already infected with the spores, immediately stepped on the gas and left the cabin. Meanwhile, on the highway not far from the forest, a woman named Meadow was walking alone. When she looked back and saw a car speeding towards her, Meadow stopped the car for a ride. As it turned out, the car that she stopped was Lowell's car. Without thinking, Lowell then allowed Meadow to ride in his car. During the trip, Meadow noticed Lowell's condition that looked strange and unwell, but Lowell didn't say anything, and neither did Meadow dare to ask. Until Lowell almost reached the peak of his mutation and his body condition began to change. Lowell suddenly stopped the car and attacked Meadow. In her panic, Meadow tried to save herself by fleeing into the forest after Lowell scratched her face and back and tried to kill her. Meadow, who was hiding behind a large tree trunk, witnessed how Lowell turned into a zombie with her own eyes. After feeling freed from Lowell's undead, Meadow rushed to seek help. After walking through the woods, she saw a car parked near the cabin. However, the car owner seemed to have suffered the same fate as Lowell, but he had actually died and his body had turned entirely into a skeleton. Meadow then checks the conditions in the cabin, and is very surprised to find a man who is horribly mutated and his body has been covered in mold. The man then begs Meadow to burn his body because that is the only way to get rid of the fungus. Meadow tried to do the last wish of the man. She had poured gasoline on the man's body and lit a flare, but in the end she didn't even have the heart to set the man on fire. Meadow then took the gun that was in the car and gave it to the man so he could end his own life. When the man shot himself, the spore fluid in his body hit the wound on Meadow's back and she was completely infected. After being infected by the spores, Meadow was seen starting to mutate, until finally collapsed unconscious. The film continues and now shows the atmosphere inside a house on October 22nd. The spore infection has spread in the city and infected most of the city's population. An old woman named Vera was hiding in a room in her house because her spore-infected neighbor had turned into an undead and tried to attack her. Vera's son, Thomas, said that the entire town had been infected by the spores and the infected residents had begun to mutate like their neighbors. Thomas told his mother that he heard a special location was completely safe from spore outbreaks and wanted to take her there. He also believed that his younger sister, Avery, and her family would definitely head to that place to take refuge. Thomas said that so his mother would not worry too much about her daughter. However, when they arrived at Avery's house, they saw her car was still at her house. The two of them then got out of the car and checked the situation inside the house. Inside the house, Thomas and Vera couldn't find Avery anywhere. The two of them instead found a box containing stock of food and weapons that seemed to have been prepared by Avery. The two of them then took the box because they felt it would be useful in their journey to find shelter. While Thomas and Vera were gathering other important equipment in the house, an undead figure was approaching their car. Meanwhile, inside the house, they start hearing strange noises coming from the barn. When they checked the situation there, both were shocked by the appearance of Avery's daughter who had been infected with spores and was mutating into an undead. The two immediately rushed to leave Avery's house by driving a car. However, unexpectedly, there was a spore undead who was already hiding in their car. Without further ado, the spore zombies immediately attacked Thomas and killed him. Vera, who witnessed her son being killed in front of her eyes, could only scream hysterically before running away in fright. The scene then switches to showing a woman named Serena who is at her house. While cleaning the house, a man suddenly walked into her house without permission. Serena then kicked the man out for trespassing. However, the man named Israel pleaded with her to be allowed to hide in her house because the situation outside was very chaotic and there were a herd of undead who tried to kill him. Serena finally gave in and let Israel take refuge in her home. Serena then says that she intends to find her sister who was lost in the forest while camping. Serena's younger sister turns out to be a woman found by the scientist at the beginning of the film who has turned into an undead. Israel then said that maybe her search would be in vain because her sister might have suffered the same fate as her brother who had been infected with the spores and mutated. Here it is finally revealed that Israel's brother was the man in the cabin who begged Meadow to burn him alive. As Serena questioned the blood on Israel's hands, they heard a loud growl from outside the house. Feeling that things were getting more and more dangerous, Israel suggested that Serena hurry away. However, Serena chose to stay because she felt safer at home. Israel then heard the moans of a woman outside the house and went straight out to check on the situation. After he came out, Serena then locked the door so he couldn't get back in because she was worried that Israel had been infected with the spores through the wound on his hand. However, Israel was banging on the door begging Serena to help him because his wife was dying and needed help. Even though Serena initially intended to ignore Israel, she ended up feeling uneasy. She then opened the door again and let them in. Israel immediately carried his wife's body, Lily, onto the table. When they were examining the spore infection wound on Lily's back, they were shocked because the wound was so severe and disgusting. There was a lump of flesh growing on Lily's back, and when Israel cut a bit of the flesh, Lily looked in a lot of pain. Israel immediately panicked because he thought he had worsened his wife's condition. Lily seemed to be in more pain as her body mutated from infection with the spores, until finally there was a growl from the wound on Lily's back and she stopped moving. Israel thought his wife was dead, but suddenly Lily's body went into a spasm and Serena tried to calm her down by covering Lily's back with a blanket. But because she felt something was strange, Serena then asked Israel to check the wound on Lily's back. Israel then obeyed Serena's words, and how shocked they were because of the drastic change in the infection wound on Lily's body, which looked throbbing and very disgusting. Meanwhile, outside the house, the monstrous creature formed from ancient spores finally appears. Meanwhile, Serena, who was increasingly frightened by Lily's condition, immediately kicked Israel and his wife out. However, Israel himself seems reluctant and afraid to touch his wife's mutated body, until in the end, a terrible creature sticks out of Lily's body and attacks Israel. Serena screamed hysterically and immediately ran out of the house. The woman was even more frightened when she saw a terrible creature outside her house and rushed off by car. The film ends by showing Serena, who is driving her car down a deserted highway. Serena intends to leave town and seek shelter. On the way, she accidentally met Vera. After confirming that each of them was free of spore infection, the two women continued on their journey together.